The ship was embarrassing. That was the first word Orathvel wrote in his assessment log when the patrol tractor beam pulled the human vessel into Veth Docking Bay 7. He chose embarrassing because the translation matrix offered nothing better. The word in his own language was closer to a thing that tries very hard and still fails to impress. But that was too long for a log header. The ship was called the Times Meridian. Human letters, blocky and crude, welded directly onto the hull in a way that suggested someone had done it by hand. The whole vessel was 847 meters long. It carried 847 humans, 1 per meter. Orathvel stared at that number for a long moment and felt something close to pity. The hull was iron alloy, dense, dull, and old-fashioned. The Veth had moved past this material more than 600 years ago. The propulsion system used actual chemical burns to push against the vacuum of space. He ran the speed calculations twice, because the first result looked wrong. At this speed, the Times, Meridian Times, would have reached its colony planet in 11 years. 11 years in a metal box, drifting through the dark. He wrote that down too. Then he went to look at the humans. The containment level was clean and well lit. The Veth prided themselves on this. They were not cruel. They were scientists. There was a significant difference, and Orathvel believed it with the full confidence of a man who had never had to explain that difference to a prisoner. The 847 humans were divided across 6 large holding areas, grouped by what the census forms called family units. The air was kept at a temperature their biology preferred. The food was nutritionally correct. Medical scans showed no serious injuries from the boarding. 3 humans had fought the Veth soldiers when they came aboard. 1 had bitten a soldier through the environmental suit. The bite had not broken the suit, but it had come very close, which was strange, because humans had flat, weak teeth by almost every biological standard. Orathvel reviewed the boarding report. The 3 fighters had been subdued with minimal force. They were now back in the general population of Holding Area 2, apparently calm. He noted this without knowing exactly why he noted it. Then, he went to Observation Post 4, which had a long glass wall looking into Holding Area 3. Inside, 32 children between the ages of 4 and 12 were playing a game. He watched. The game had no equipment, no tools. It used only the children's bodies and the empty floor of the holding room. 2 children would move to opposite sides. 1 child would close their eyes and count. He could hear the numbers through the audio feed, low and steady. Then, the counting child would open their eyes and try to find them. On the surface, this was ordinary. Many species had games like this, simple social bonding, a way for young minds to process stress. But these children were not just hiding. The 2 hiders were talking to each other with small hand signals before they moved, not random gestures, a specific set that they both clearly understood. They were using the larger children as moving cover, rotating the pattern so that the seeker's eyes would always land on the wrong body first. When one hider was spotted, the other immediately shifted to use the moment of noise and movement as cover. Orathvel watched 6 rounds. By round 4, both hiders had never been caught at the same time. He filed it under primitive stress displacement behavior, cooperative subtype. He moved on. He was wrong about almost everything he would ever write in his career. He was most wrong about this. The woman in Holding Area 3 was named Delara Ose, 34 years old. The manifest listed her as the colony's agricultural planning coordinator, soil composition, water tables, long cycle crop rotation. Useful knowledge for a colony world. Not useful in a Veth detention bay. She was sitting against the far wall when he arrived at the observation post. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't talking to the people around her. She was looking at the wall across from her in the calm, patient way of someone doing slow arithmetic in their head. Orathvel watched her for a moment before she looked up. She looked directly at the observation glass. She could not see him. The glass was one way. She had no way of knowing there was anyone standing on the other side. But she looked at the exact spot where his face was, and she held it. He counted. 1 second, 2, 3, 11 seconds. He looked away first. He stood in the corridor afterward and felt a thing he didn't immediately have a name for. He wrote observation note. Subject in Area 3 demonstrates unusual behavioral pattern. Continued monitoring. Warranted. And filed it. Then he thought about those 11 seconds for the rest of the night, and he didn't file anything more about them. The oldest human aboard the Times, Meridian Times, was a man named Gregor Vasek, 71 years old. One functioning lung, the right one, had been removed at some point in his past, and the scar tissue across his right side told a story that the medical scanner catalogued, but that Orithvel didn't have enough context to read. Both hands showed what the scanner called degenerative joint inflammation, which the translation matrix rendered simply as constant, worsening pain with movement. The manifest listed him as Civilian Elder Advisor, an honorary title, the kind given to an old man so he would feel useful on a long journey. That was what Orithvel assumed. Vasek spent his first 3 days in holding Area 1 doing what appeared to be nothing. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, using the wall for support. He sat in different corners at different hours. He had short, quiet conversations with the other humans, fast and low, full of words that were not in the standard human language database, which the translation matrix flagged and then gave up on. On day 3, a young man in Area 1 gave him a piece of cloth torn from the inside lining of a jacket. Orithvel saw it happen and logged it as a social bonding exchange. A gift. Nothing more. He didn't know what Vasek did with the cloth until day 5, when a routine visual sweep of Area 1 caught the old man pressing his thumb against the fabric and dragging it slowly across the floor near the back wall. The scan enhanced the image. It was a map, not a rough sketch. A detailed architectural map of the holding level corridors, junctions, the spacing between guard posts, the location of the emergency seal controls, the rotation pattern of the wall-mounted cameras. It was drawn in something dark and rust-red that the chemical analysis identified as blood, the old man's own blood, from the cracked skin of his arthritic hands. Orithvel stared at the image for a long time. He thought about filing it as a security flag. He didn't file it. He moved the image to a private folder and told himself it was because one old man with a hand-drawn map was not a realistic security concern. He told himself the map was incomplete. It was missing 2 corridors. He told himself the man was 71 years old with one lung and hands that caused him constant pain. He told himself all of this. Later, much later, he would understand that he had been afraid, not of Vasek, not of the map itself, of what the map said about the 3 days that came before it. The old man had been measuring everything from the moment the door closed. The Times, Meridian's Times automated distress beacon had activated the instant the Veth patrol vessel made unplanned hull contact. Standard human protocol, the beacon encrypted the ship's last known coordinates and status and transmitted them toward the nearest communication relay. The nearest relay, in this part of the outer arm, was 14 months from Earth. The signal would take 14 months to arrive. Orithvel included this in his initial report. He noted it as a comfort. 14 months for the signal to reach Earth, and then, whatever time it took for a species with chemical propulsion to attempt any kind of response. The math was very clean. He said so in the report. He did not know, no one in the conclave knew, because it was not the sort of thing you thought to find out that human long-range communication did not depend on relay points. The humans had built a network of quantum-paired communication nodes across their settled space 18 months ago. The Times. Meridian's Times distress signal reached Earth in 47 minutes. He also did not know that Earth's Unified Defense Command had been quietly tracking Veth patrol patterns in this region for 7 months. The Times, Meridian Times, was not the first ship to go dark in this area. It was the 5th. The first 4 had been unmanned. The 5th was not. This was not an accident. The response from Earth Command, when it came, was not a diplomatic message. It was not a formal protest. It was not a request for explanation. It was an inventory request transmitted to 37 military and manufacturing installations simultaneously. Current stockpile count on the following: long-range ballistic platforms, anti-ship kinetic rounds, breach entry units, atmospheric drop vehicles, medical field kits. The subject line read, "Pre-campaign assessment. Respond within 72 hours." Orithvel never saw this message. It moved on a channel the Veth had not found yet. But even if he had seen it, he wasn't sure, later, that it would have changed much. He wasn't sure what he would have done with information that made no sense for a Class 2 species. A Class 2 civilization didn't send pre-campaign assessments 47 minutes after contact. A Class 2 civilization sent diplomats. It asked questions. It tried to understand the rules. It didn't start counting before the door was closed. He submitted his preliminary assessment to the Conclave Science Division on day 6 of the Times Meridian's Times detention. 43 pages. Human biology, psychology, social structure, technology level, cultural markers, threat assessment. The biology section noted that humans were unusually durable for their size, bone density higher than expected, a pain tolerance that the medical scans rated as genuinely elevated rather than simply trained, and an immune system that looked as though it had been tested very hard by something large and persistent across a very long span of time. He noted this as biologically interesting. He did not flag it as relevant to threat level. The threat assessment section was 4 pages long. It classified humanity as a Class II emerging civilization, with no meaningful military capacity, and no realistic ability to project force outside their own star system. The chemical propulsion alone made this functionally certain. You cannot fight a war you cannot reach. He recommended standard contact protocol. Detain the Times Meridian. Catalog the colony site coordinates. Send a formal notification of territorial boundary establishment. Release the humans on a return course to their home system within 60 days. Clean, professional, documented correctly. The Conclave approved the report in full. That evening, Orathville went back to observation post 4. The children were playing the same game. They were faster now. The hand signals had compressed smaller finger movements that the camera almost missed. The seeker never caught both hiders in the same round. The seeker was also a different child each time. They were taking turns being the one who had to figure it out. They were teaching each other, he realized, how to read a moving target. He stood at the glass and watched for 40 minutes. He wrote nothing in his log. He went back to his quarters and lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought about a map drawn in an old man's blood, and a woman who held eye contact with a one-way mirror for 11 seconds, and children who had turned a hiding game into something that had a strategy and a curriculum. He turned the light out. He didn't sleep well. On day 9, he requested behavioral interviews with 3 adults. Standard practice direct conversation gave information that observation could not. He selected from the manifest a colony engineer named Paulo Reyes, a school teacher named Jin-hee Park, the agricultural planner, Dilara Osei. The room was small, plain. 3 chairs, 1 table, 1 translation terminal. He sat across from each of them separately for 40 minutes. Paulo Reyes was polite and cooperative. He answered every question about the colony's planned purpose, the equipment aboard, the timeline they had been working toward. He showed no visible fear. He appeared helpful in the careful, measured way of someone who had decided that helpfulness was the smartest available option. Jin-hee Park talked about her students with real warmth. She answered every question about colony logistics with friendly detail. She also, somewhere inside those 40 minutes, asked Orathville 12 questions about Veth biology, cultural customs, governance structure, military rank, patrol rotation, frequency. She asked them the way you ask about the weather, casually, between other topics, as if she was simply curious, and the curiosity was harmless. He answered 6 of them before he realized what was happening. He ended the interview early. He sat alone in the room afterward and looked at the table. Dilara Osei came in last. She sat down and looked at him, not at the room, not at the terminal on the wall, at him specifically, and said nothing. She waited. He started his prepared questions. She answered each one. Short, accurate, cooperative. She confirmed everything already on the manifest. She gave him nothing he didn't already have. When he finished, she said, "Can I ask you something?" He said yes. She said, "How many people are on your ship?" He didn't answer. She nodded, like he had. He walked back to his quarters through corridors that felt, for the first time, slightly too narrow. He thought about the 12 questions slipped into 40 minutes of friendly conversation like stones dropped quietly into deep water. He thought about Dilara Osei asking the one question that actually mattered. He thought about the map in the private folder. He opened his log. He started a new file, separate from the official system, titled Supplementary Behavioral Notes Personal Record. He didn't put a date on it. He didn't link it to the official case number. He wrote for 2 hours. Then he stopped and sat and looked at what he had written. He had never kept a private file before in his professional life. He was not certain why he was doing it now. He told himself it was just good practice. Thorough documentation. Nothing unusual. He did not look too hard at that explanation. The Times, Meridian Times, sat in docking bay, 7 for 60 days. Exactly as the approved protocol specified. The humans ate the food. They slept when the lights dimmed. They were, by every standard measure, compliant and calm. They were also, though Orathvel would not understand this fully until later, working the entire time. Paulo Reyes had spent 60 days calculating the structural load tolerances of the bay doors, using nothing but visual observation and the engineering knowledge already inside his head. Jinhee Park had built a complete behavioral map of every guard shift, hidden inside lesson plans she was writing for the children in neat, small handwriting. Delara Osei had been doing something with the nutritional data on their food that his scans caught but couldn't interpret. Gregor Vasic had updated his blood-drawn map 4 times. Each version was more accurate than the last. On day 58, he found the 2 missing corridors. The children were faster every day. On day 60, the Conclave released the Times, Meridian Times, on a return trajectory, exactly as approved. Orathvel watched from the observation deck. The ship was still small, still slow, still loud with its chemical burn, shrinking against the dark until it was a point of light. Then, nothing. He stood there for a while. His private file was 14 pages long. He didn't know that the Times, Meridian Times, was not going home. He didn't know it was heading for a rendezvous 0.6 light weeks away, where it would meet a very different kind of ship. He didn't know that Vasic had already transmitted the complete map, the guard rotation data, the structural calculations, and a full behavioral profile of Veth military personnel to Earth Command. He didn't know any of it. But standing at the observation deck, watching the small, slow ship disappear into the dark, Orathvel had a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. It was the feeling of a man who has just released something from a jar without first checking what was inside. He went back to his quarters. He opened his private file. He started writing. The war vote in the Veth conclave lasted 4 hours. This was considered a long time. Most votes lasted 40 minutes. The 4 hours were not spent debating whether to act. That was settled in the first 15 minutes. The remaining 3 hours and 45 minutes were spent debating what to call the action, because no one on the conclave floor wanted to use the word war for something being done to a species that had chemical rockets and iron hull plating. They settled on territorial enforcement operation. 40 warships were assigned. The fleet commander was a Veth admiral named Srath Ka, who had run 17 campaigns across her 400-year career, and who, when given the mission brief on the human home system, spent approximately 6 seconds reviewing it before setting it face down on her desk. 6 seconds was all it needed. The math was that clean. 1 inhabited planet, 1 moon base, partially constructed. A small scattering of orbital stations. Chemical propulsion throughout. No energy weapons on record. Kinetic projectile systems only. Short range, atmosphere dependent. She gave it 11 cycles to full resolution. Her adjutant, privately, thought 11 was generous. Orathvel was not on the fleet. He was a scientist. His place was in the analysis center on Veth Prime, receiving data packets from the front as the operation moved forward. He had requested to join the fleet as an observer. The request had been denied on the grounds that the operation was not expected to produce scientifically novel data. He accepted this. He sat at his desk in the analysis center and opened the incoming data feeds and began reading. The first engagements were exactly what the projections said they would be. Human defensive positions at the outer colony sites were thin and poorly coordinated. Human weapons technology performed at the modeled level, effective within short range, ineffective against Veth shielding at distance. Human casualties were running slightly above projected rates, and Veth casualties were running slightly below. The math held. He read the reports with the calm of a man whose hypothesis is being confirmed in real time. He noted each data point. He logged them in the official system. On the 8th day, his adjutant, a young analyst named Paris, walked in and set a tablet on his desk without speaking. Orathvel looked up. "Secondary data flag," Paris said. "I didn't know whether to put it in the main feed." Orathvel looked at the tablet. It was not a casualty report. It was a pattern analysis, a comparison of human tactical behavior across the first 7 days of engagement. The analysis had been generated automatically by the data processing system, flagged as an anomaly, and routed to Paris's queue. The humans were losing at modeled rates, but the response pattern was changing. Not soldier to soldier, not unit to unit. The doctrine itself, the way humans were organizing their defense at a strategic level, was shifting between engagements. Each battle was slightly different from the one before it. The differences were small, individually. But the pattern of the differences was not random. It was directional. Each engagement showed an adjustment that addressed a specific weakness from the previous one. They were learning. Not slowly, not clumsily, fast and clean, like watching something decide that the way it had been moving was inefficient, and then simply move differently. Orathvel stared at the analysis for a long time. "Send it to command," he said. Paris nodded. "I did. 4 hours ago." "What did they say?" "Primitive species adapt defensively under pressure. Expected behavior. No action required." Orathvel set the tablet down. He opened his private file. He wrote one sentence. "They are not adapting to survive. They are adapting to understand us." Then he went back to the official data feed and kept reading. Admiral Srath-Ka saw the trenches on day 12 and laughed. She laughed the way you laugh at something that is so far behind the times that it becomes almost charming. Trenches. Actual trenches, long cuts in the ground, reinforced with metal and packed earth, connected to each other by covered passages. Her species had used trench systems in their first recorded war, 4 centuries ago, before they had any technology worth mentioning. "They're digging holes," she said to her tactical officer. Her tactical officer, a younger Veth named Voss, looked at the scan data and said nothing for a moment. "They're connected," he said. "Trenches connect. That's what they know." He pulled the scan wider. "Look at the whole system." She looked. The trench network was not a defensive line. It was a web. It stretched across the entire target zone in a pattern that had no obvious front. Every position connected to at least 3 others. The covered passages ran deep not just below the surface but into pre-existing underground structures that the humans had clearly already hollowed out before the Veth fleet arrived. Supply caches, medical stations, communication relays running on physical wire, which was immune to the Veth signal jamming systems because it was not using any signal at all. The civilian population was gone from the entire region. Not evacuating, gone. They had been moved weeks before the Veth arrived, before Srath-Ka had even been assigned the mission. She stood very still. "When did they know we were coming?" she said. Voss looked at the data. "Based on the construction timeline?" He paused. "Before we did." The psychological operations file landed on Orathvel's desk on day 19. It had been intercepted from human command communications and flagged for translation. The translator had been unable to produce a clean output because the document used a category of terminology that didn't exist in the Veth language database. The category was psychological operations. He spent 2 days building a working definition from context and cross-reference. When he finished, he sat very still at his desk for a long time. Then he went and found the strongest thing he was permitted to drink on a working day, which was not very strong, and he drank it. And he went back to his desk. Psychological operations. A deliberate, planned, budgeted effort to make the enemy afraid. Not as a side effect of combat. Not as something that happened naturally when you won battles. As an active strategic tool, separate from the fighting itself. With its own command structure, its own personnel, its own objectives and timelines and metrics for success. The humans had a department for making the Veth afraid. It had a budget. He put this in his private file and then he put it in the official file too, because some information was too large to keep private. He sent it to command with a priority flag. Command's response came back in 3 hours. Noted. Psychological destabilization attempts are expected from a cornered species. Continue monitoring. He read the response twice. He filed it. He did not feel reassured. On day 23, the 847 humans from the Times, Meridian Times, escaped from Veth custody. They were not rescued. The human relief fleet was still 4 months out. They were in a detention facility on a Veth station deep inside Conclave space, far from any human ship. They left on their own. The official investigation that followed was thorough and deeply uncomfortable reading. The escape had been planned from the first day of detention. Orathvel knew this when he read it, and felt a coldness that started in his chest and moved outward. Gregor Vasik's blood-drawn maps, the behavioral profiles built by Jinhee Park, the structural tolerances calculated by Paulo Reyes, the guard pattern data collected by every adult across 60 days. All of it had been transmitted to Earth Command, and Earth Command had transmitted it back in an encrypted package, disguised as a routine nutritional supplement order, which a Veth logistics officer had approved without examining, because approving nutritional orders was not a task that required careful attention. The package contained a full escape route, timing windows, and a set of improvised tool designs that could be built from components found in a standard Veth holding facility. Vasek had run the operation from inside, with both arthritic hands and one lung. All 847 humans made it out. 2 Veth guards were injured, neither critically. The humans had been careful about that. Orithvel sat with the investigation report for a long time. The part he kept returning to was not the escape itself. The escape was extraordinary, but it was explainable. What he kept returning to was the timeline. They had started planning on day 1, before they knew they would be there 60 days, before they knew the layout of any facility beyond the Times Meridian's time zone holding areas, before they had any of the information they would later use. They had started on day 1 because they had simply assumed that whatever came next would require a plan, and that it was better to start early. He wrote 5 pages in his private file that night. He crossed out 3 of them. He couldn't find the right words. He filed the official summary. He closed his desk. He went to bed and lay there with his eyes open and thought about an old man in a room he'd never seen before, picking up a piece of torn cloth on day 3 and starting. The first human counteroffensive was nothing like what Srath Ka had prepared for. She had prepared for a frontal engagement. The human commander, a general named Hideo Marin, had been broadcasting his intentions quite clearly for 11 days. Troop movements, supply chain signals, communication chatter that painted a very specific picture of where and when the attack would come. Srath Ka had responded correctly. She had pulled forces from 3 secondary sectors and concentrated them at the predicted coordinates. She was there. Her fleet was there. Her ground forces were there. The coordinates were empty. The counteroffensive hit the 3 secondary sectors simultaneously. Not a probe. Not a small diversion. A full committed offensive across 3 fronts at once, each one precisely targeted at the gaps created when she pulled forces to meet the attack that never came. She lost 42 positions in 17 hours. She stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the tactical map and felt something she had not felt in 400 years of command. She did not have a good word for it. It was the feeling of reaching for a wall and finding open air. She sent an immediate report to the conclave. Enemy is employing deliberate misdirection at operational scale. Intelligence suggests broadcast communications were intentionally falsified to shape our force deployment. Recommend immediate threat reclassification. The conclave's response took 6 hours. Assessment noted. Operational misdirection is consistent with a cornered species making final defensive efforts. Current classification maintained. Continue operation. She read the response twice. She did not send a reply. She pulled up the tactical map and began building the next deployment. She had spent 4 centuries learning how wars worked. She understood force ratios, supply lines, morale curves, the mathematics of attrition. She understood them deeply, the way you understand things that have always been true. She was beginning to understand, slowly and with great discomfort, that some of what she knew might be specific to the wars she had fought, that there might be a different kind of war, with different rules, that she had never seen before. She did not sleep that night, not the way she usually slept. She kept waking up to check the tactical map. Orithvel's private file hit 47 pages on the day he received the full report on General Marin's counteroffensive. He read it 3 times. Then he did something he had not done in his career. He requested a formal meeting with the Conclave Intelligence Directorate, and he asked them to update the human threat classification from Class 2 to Class 4. Class 4 was the designation reserved for species with demonstrated tactical sophistication, adaptive warfighting doctrine, and the proven capacity to inflict serious losses on a superior force. No Class 2 species had ever been reclassified to Class 4 inches a single step. The gap between them was enormous. It represented not just a difference in technology but a difference in how a species understood conflict itself. The Directorate reviewed his request for 2 days. Their response was brief. Request denied. Reclassification at this stage would have significant morale implications for both military and civilian populations. Current classification maintained pending further operational data. Dr. Oreth Vel is advised to focus on his assigned analytical function. He sat at his desk and read the response. He read it again. He put it in his private file, which was now 48 pages long. Then he opened the official data feed and went back to work. There was a new behavioral report from the front. A Veth strike unit had captured what appeared to be a human command post, and they had found something inside that the field team couldn't categorize and had sent to analysis. He opened the attached files. They were notebooks, physical notebooks, filled with handwriting, dozens of them. The translation team had already worked through the first 3. They were after-action reviews, detailed, methodical records of every engagement the unit had fought, what had worked, what had failed, what had been unexpected, and what the unit planned to do differently as a result. Every entry was signed. Every entry had a date. The earliest notebook in the stack was 6 months old. The humans had been doing this before the war started. They had been reviewing actions that, 6 months ago, were just training exercises. They had been treating their peacetime preparation the same way they were now treating active combat, as a source of data, as a system to be examined and improved. Oreth Vel held one of the notebooks for a moment. It was small and worn. The cover was soft from handling. Someone had carried this thing for 6 months and written in it regularly and kept it. He set it down carefully. He opened his private file. He looked at the 48 pages he had written over the past weeks. He thought about what they added up to. He thought about what he was going to do about it. He started writing his next unofficial report not to the directorate, not to command, not to anyone in the official system. He was writing it for himself, because somebody needed to write it down clearly, even if nobody was ready to read it yet. What we are calling adaptation, he wrote, is not adaptation. Adaptation is a thing that happens to a species slowly, over time, under pressure. What this species does is different. They examine their own failures with the same cold interest a scientist brings to a failed experiment. They do not mourn the failure, they use it. Each loss is information. Each mistake is data. They have been doing this formally, systematically, with written records for longer than we have been watching them. We entered this conflict believing we understood what war was. We understood what war has been among the 5 spacefaring species we have known. We understood wars that end. Wars that have clear sides and clear goals and clean resolutions. Wars that both participants approach with the same basic assumptions about how war works. I do not think this species shares our assumptions. I do not think they ever did. He stopped writing. He looked at the worn notebook on his desk. He thought about day 3, on the Times Meridian, a piece of cloth, an old man picking it up. Starting. 18 months in, the Veth were winning. This was the official position of the conclave, and the numbers supported it. The Veth held 63% of contested space. Human colony sites in the outer arm had been either captured or evacuated. Human casualties were running above the projected rate. 3 of humanity's outer planets were under Veth blockade. The fleet was intact. The supply lines were solid. The operation was behind its original timeline, but it was moving in the right direction. The conclave briefings were confident. Oreth Vel read the briefings every morning and said nothing. He kept reading the secondary data. The secondary data told a different story. Not a story about territory or casualties or supply lines. A story about something harder to put in a chart. The Veth were winning every week. And every week, the cost of winning went up. Not by much. Not in any way that triggered an official flag. But Oreth Vel was watching the numbers closely, and he could see the slope. In month 1, a Veth strike unit would neutralize a human position and take a predictable level of losses. In month 6, the same type of strike against a similar type of position was costing more. Not dramatically more, just more. The human positions were harder to take each time. He ran a comparison. He mapped the cost of every engagement type across 18 months and laid them side by side. The line moved upward, slowly, steadily, without any single dramatic jump. He stared at the line for a long time. He had a word for this in his own language. It was an engineering word. It described a mechanism that could only move in one direction. A gear that clicked forward and never back. The word was used to describe processes that were irreversible, that accumulated, that built on themselves without the possibility of undoing what had already been done. He wrote the word at the top of a new page in his private file. Ratchet. He underlined it. The captured field logs arrived on a Tuesday. A Veth ground unit had taken a human forward command post in the outer colony zone. A fast raid, well executed. One of the cleaner operations of the past few months. The post had been abandoned in a hurry. Equipment was left behind. Papers, personal items, and a hard drive belonging to the post's commanding officer, a human general named Arnav Desai. The hard drive was encrypted. It took the Veth analysis team 9 days to open it. Inside were Desai's personal command logs, 600 entries across 15 months. Orathvel received the translation package and opened the first entry. He read for an hour. Then he stopped and sat at his desk and did nothing for a while. He had expected fear. Not dramatic, falling apart fear, but the kind that leaks into a person's private writing when they're losing small doubts. Thin hope, the ache of seeing your side take damage and not knowing if it will hold. General Desai's logs did not contain fear. They contained analysis. Entry after entry. Desai had written up the previous engagement with the same cool technical focus that Arathvel used when writing research papers. What had worked? What had failed? Why it had failed? Specifically, at the component level, not our left flank collapsed, but our left flank collapsed because Veth energy weapons at this range outpace our shield rotation cycle by approximately 0.3 seconds, and therefore our defensive posture at that range needs to change in the following way. He was excited, not cheerful under pressure, not falsely optimistic. Genuinely, technically excited, the way a person gets when a complicated problem starts to yield to sustained attention. In month 4 he had written, beginning to understand the Veth targeting priority sequence. If my reading is correct, they always neutralize communication assets before support assets before frontline assets. This is a predictable pattern. I want to test something. 3 entries later. Test confirmed. Now designing around it. Orathvel sat with this for a long time. Then he forwarded the full translation to a Veth strike commander named Leth, who ran the ground operations division, with a note that said, "Please read entries 47 through 112. These are not the logs of a losing commander." Leth's response came back in an hour. Noted. Commander appears to be rationalizing losses. Psychological coping pattern. Not operationally significant. Orathvel read the response. He wrote in his private file. She did not read entries 47 through 112. The faint problem broke 3 of the conclave's senior tactical analysts in the span of 6 weeks. Not broke in a dramatic way. Broke in the quiet, grinding way that happens when a mind built around one set of rules is forced to operate inside a different set, without being told the rules have changed. The Veth had fought 3 wars in their recorded history. In all 3, both sides went where they said they were going. Forces moved toward objectives. Objectives were held, or lost. The math of the battle was visible in the positions of the armies. If you understood where the forces were, you understood the battle. This was not a choice the Veth had made. They had simply never encountered a war fought any other way. It had never occurred to anyone that the direction forces appeared to be moving could be deliberately wrong. That a commander might announce a target, commit visible resources to it, generate all the signals of genuine intent and be doing all of it specifically, so that the enemy would believe it. The first analyst to crack was a veteran strategist named Torath Hin. He spent 2 weeks trying to find the real human position behind every visible one. He built elaborate models showing where the genuine objectives must be, given that the stated ones were decoys. His models were wrong because his fundamental assumption was wrong. There was no single hidden real objective sitting behind the fake one. The deception was the strategy. The confusion was the weapon. He submitted a request for reassignment on medical grounds. It was denied. The second analyst started treating every human communication as false by default and working backward from there. He predicted, with some accuracy, 2 out of 5 major human movements. He was reassigned when the 3 he missed resulted in the loss of a supply depot. The third analyst, a young woman named Sev, did something different. She stopped trying to find the real position and started mapping the confusion itself. Where was the Veth attention being directed? What were the humans making them look at? And then, What were they therefore not looking at? This worked. Orathvel requested that Sev be promoted immediately and given her own analysis team. The conclave approved the promotion. They did not approve the team. Budget implication. The phrase that stopped Admiral Shrath-Ka mid-sentence appeared in an intercepted human command communication on month 14. She was in the middle of a briefing when her signals officer quietly set a printout in front of her. She glanced at it. She kept talking for 2 more sentences and then stopped. The phrase was, "Optimal psychological pressure window." She picked up the printout. The intercepted message was from a human planning division she had never seen before, not a combat unit, not a logistics team. It was labeled, in the translation, Strategic Influence Operations. The message discussed the timing of an upcoming engagement, not in terms of tactical advantage, not in terms of position or supply or numbers, but in terms of how the Veth forces would be feeling at that moment. How tired they would be. Whether morale would be at a low point. Whether the units involved had recently suffered losses that would make them hesitant. The humans were planning around how the Veth felt. They had built a department to study it. She excused everyone from the briefing room. She sat alone and read the full intercepted message. The document did not read like military communication. It read like a research paper. It had citations. It referenced previous operations and their psychological outcomes in footnotes. It discussed the effects of sustained uncertainty on decision-making quality in Veth command staff, and it did so with the casual authority of people who had been tracking this for a long time and had drawn some clear conclusions. One sentence near the end had been highlighted by the translation team, who had flagged it as potentially significant. It read, "Recommend maintaining current operational tempo. Veth Command is exhibiting signs of analysis paralysis at the senior level. Continued ambiguity in our strategic intent will accelerate this process." She set the document down. She looked at the wall. She thought about how many of her decisions in the past 6 months had been made in a fog of uncertainty about what the humans were actually doing and where they were actually going. She thought about the hours spent debating which signals were real and which were misdirection. She thought about the meetings that ran long, the decisions that were delayed, the positions held or abandoned based on intelligence that turned out to be wrong in ways she still didn't fully understand. The humans had not been causing that fog by accident. They had been building it. On purpose. With a department, she sent the document to Orathvel with a single line of accompanying text. "How long has this been happening?" He replied within the hour. "Since the beginning. I believe this is what they call standard practice." She did not respond to that. Orathvel's private file crossed 100 pages on the day he received the behavioral reports from the outer colony engagements. These reports were different from the tactical data. They were observations small, specific things that individual Veth soldiers and officers had noted and passed up the chain because they didn't know where else to put them. Things that didn't fit anywhere in the existing reporting structure. A Veth soldier noted that the human unit he had engaged seemed to be running a drill during the battle, not a training exercise before or after. During, while taking fire, 2 of the humans had been talking to each other in a way the soldier described as like they were teaching. A Veth officer noted that after capturing a human supply depot, her unit found the supplies organized in a way that suggested they had been staged for rapid loss, positioned so that an enemy could take them quickly, but so that the most critical items were already gone. The humans had anticipated losing that position and had removed what mattered before the Veth arrived. The officer described finding the empty crates and having the unpleasant feeling of having been handed something. A junior analyst noted that human commanders rotated frequently not because of casualties, but by apparent design. A new commander would take over a unit that had seen heavy fighting, run 3 or 4 engagements, and then rotate out. The next commander would come in and run 3 or 4 more. The analyst flagged this as unusual because Veth commanders stayed with their units. Continuity was important. Institutional knowledge lived in the commander. Orathvel stared at this last one for a long time. He understood it slowly. The humans were not keeping the knowledge in the commander. They were keeping it in the records. Each commander left detailed written reviews. The next commander read them and picked up where the previous one left off. The knowledge didn't walk out the door when the commander rotated. It stayed. The knowledge was in the notebooks. The knowledge was always in the notebooks. He thought about the worn notebook he had held in his hands weeks ago. The small soft cover. the 6 months of entries. He thought about what it meant that they had been writing things down and rotating through them long before this war started, that this was simply how they operated, that the institutional memory of a human military unit did not depend on any individual staying alive or staying in place. You could not cut the head off this thing and watch it stop moving. The head was not where it kept its memories. He submitted his second reclassification request on month 16. He had spent 2 weeks building the argument from the ground up, not from instinct, from data. He mapped the cost per engagement slope. He documented the psychological operations program. He compiled the after-action review system. He built a case that was 67 pages long and cited 212 specific incidents from the official data feed. He classified humanity as a persistent adaptive threat, a category that, technically, did not exist in the Conclave's classification system. He had invented it. He had written a 3-page appendix explaining why the existing categories were inadequate. He sent the full package to the Intelligence Directorate, the Military Command Board, and the Conclave's Senior Science Division. The Military Command Board replied in 4 hours. Dr. Orathvel's analysis is noted. The reclassification is denied on operational and morale grounds. We remind Dr. Orathvel that the operation is proceeding and that current territorial control metrics show continued VETH advantage. Reclassification at this stage would undermine public confidence in the operation and create uncertainty in active field commands. Dr. Orathvel is advised that further unsolicited reclassification requests may result in a review of his analytical role. He read the response 3 times, then he printed it. He put it in a physical folder. He wrote the date on the front of the folder in his own handwriting. He filed it with the other physical copies he had been keeping. He was building a record, not for the Conclave, not for command, for whatever came after all of this. When someone would need to understand how it happened, he went back to work. On month 18, the humans did something that nobody in the VETH military had a word for. They stopped retreating, not because they had run out of space to retreat into, not because they were surrounded. They simply stopped, at a moment that the VETH tactical models did not predict, and turned, not at one location, at 31 locations, simultaneously. 31 counterattacks in 18 hours, across 3 star systems, each one targeted at a position the VETH had taken in the previous 4 months, each one hitting a specific structural weakness that, when Orathvel analyzed it afterward, correlated almost perfectly with the cost per engagement data he had been tracking. The humans knew which positions had cost the VETH the most to take. They knew which ones would cost the most to defend. They had been waiting, not retreating because they were losing. Retreating because they needed the VETH spread out and positioned in a specific way before they moved. 18 months of what looked like losing, which had been, at some level, Orathvel was only now beginning to see. 18 months of preparation. The VETH lost 4 contested systems in 11 days. Srathka sent him a message. No text, just a file attachment, the full after-action analysis from her tactical team. He opened it. He read it. He closed it. He sat at his desk in the analysis center on VETH Prime and looked at the wall opposite him and thought about a ratchet, a mechanism that moves in only one direction, that builds, that accumulates, that cannot be reversed. He had drawn the line on a graph 18 months ago and watched it move upward, week by week, a little more each time. He understood now what the line was. It was not a measure of the war's progress. It was a measure of what the humans were learning, and it had never once moved the other way. His private file was 112 pages. He stopped adding to it. There was nothing in it he didn't already carry by heart. The intelligence team that breached humanity's global data network had been trained for 3 years. They were good at their work. They had successfully penetrated 9 different alien data systems across the Conclave's history, and they approached the human network with the professional calm of people who expected to spend 2 weeks inside someone else's files and come out with a useful set of answers. They were inside the network in 4 days. They came out in 11. 3 of the 6 team members requested immediate reassignment. The other 3 submitted their report and then went on extended leave, which the Conclave granted without requiring an explanation because the report itself was explanation enough. The report landed on Orathvel's desk on a Wednesday morning. It was 1,100 pages long. The team lead, A woman named Arith had attached a personal note at the front that read, simply, "I don't know what to do with this. I'm sending it to you." He started reading. He had expected agriculture records, trade routes, civil engineering plans, the kind of data infrastructure a Class II civilization builds when it's trying to hold its own system together, the record-keeping of a species that is busy just managing to exist. Practical things. Grounded things. The files of a civilization still figuring out how to feed itself. The first archive he opened was labeled, in translation, Military History Comprehensive Record. It was not a small file. The Veth had 3 wars on record across their entire history as a spacefaring species. They had fought 2 border disputes before that, in their pre-space era. 5 conflicts, total, across thousands of years. They were proud of this. It spoke well of them as a civilization. They had learned, early, that conflict was expensive, and resolution was better. The human archive contained records of over 400 wars. This was the number the translation team had flagged in their summary, and Orathvel had assumed it was a translation error. He went into the archive directly and counted 416 distinct wars, categorized, dated, and archived. And this was only the comprehensive list. The archive had subsections: sub-wars inside wars, regional conflicts, civil wars, a category of war that required a moment of quiet reflection because it meant wars fought by a species against itself, which was something Orathvel's people had never done and had no word for. The dates on the oldest records went back more than 4,000 years. They had been fighting for 4,000 years, and they had written all of it down. He found the military philosophy texts in a sub-archive labeled Strategic Theory Historical. He did not know, at first, what he was looking at. The first document had no author listed in the initial translation, just a date that placed it approximately 2,500 years in the past. He assumed it was a religious or ceremonial text. The language was old and the structure was unlike anything he had read. He read the first section. He put it down. He picked it up again. He read it more carefully. It was a tactical manual, a detailed, specific, organized guide to the conduct of war, deception, terrain, logistics, the management of information, the psychology of command. 2,500 years old, written when humanity was still fighting with metal weapons and animal power. He cross-referenced it against the tactical patterns he had been observing for the past 18 months. The cross-references lit up like a fire. The feints were in there. The misdirection. The way to make an enemy exhaust himself on the wrong target. The importance of knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. The entire framework of what humanity had been doing to the Veth fleet for a year and a half, the foundation of it. The basic structure, the core philosophy was sitting in a document written 2,500 years ago by a man whose name, when the translation finally resolved it, was Sun Tzu. Orathvel's hands were not entirely steady when he put the document down. He sat in his chair and stared at the opposite wall for a long time. 2,500 years ago. They had figured this out as a philosophical exercise. They had written it down. They had kept it. They had taught it. And some version of it was still being used, still being applied, still being tested and refined. 25 centuries later, he thought about what it meant that this was not new knowledge for them, that this was old. He read Clausewitz next, a theorist from 200 years ago, practically recent, by the standard of the archive, dense and methodical, and full of ideas that were, again, familiar in the most disorienting way, because they described things the Veth had been experiencing in this war, with precision that felt personal. He read about centers of gravity, the idea that every enemy has a core thing, a point on which their whole strength depends, and that the purpose of war is to find that point and strike it, not to destroy everything, just the one thing that holds everything else up. He thought about what the humans knew about the Veth's center of gravity. He thought about the psychological operations program. He thought about the document that had described analysis paralysis at the senior level as a deliberate objective. They had been striking the center of gravity. They had been striking it from day one, before the shooting started, with misdirection and uncertainty, and the slow draining of confidence that comes from never quite knowing what the other side is really doing. He kept reading. There was a theorist named Boyd who had developed a framework built around the speed of decision-making, the idea that victory went not to the side with the most force, but to the side that could observe, decide, and act faster than the other. Who could make the enemy's world change faster than the enemy could process the changes? Who could run the loop of action and response so quickly that the other side was always reacting to something that had already stopped being true? Orethvel put Boyd down and looked at his notes from month 3, when he had written that the human doctrines seemed to be changing faster than the Veth could respond to it. He had written it as an observation without a framework. Boyd had written the framework 200 years ago. The humans had been doing Boyd. They had been doing Boyd before the conclave knew what Boyd was. He called Paris into his office on the 4th day of reading and told him to clear his schedule. Paris sat across the desk and waited. Orethvel said, "How many wars has our species fought? Total, in all of recorded history." Paris thought for a moment. 5, including the 2 pre-space conflicts. How many people did we lose? Total, across all 5. Paris was quiet for longer this time. I would need to look at the exact numbers, but in the range of several 100,000, including the pre-space conflicts. 10. Orethvel pushed a printout across the desk. It was a table from the Human Archive. Casualty counts, organized by century. He had compiled it himself from the sub-archives, checking the numbers 3 times because the first 2 times he thought he was making an error. Paris looked at the table. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "This is just 1 century," he said. "The 20th. How many centuries are in the record?" 40. And the numbers in the earlier centuries are less complete. There were conflicts that weren't recorded in full. Paris set the table down. He looked at his own hands. He looked at the table again. "How are they still here?" he said. It came out quiet, like a question he hadn't meant to say out loud. Orethvel had been thinking about this since the blood-drawn maps. Since the children on the Times Meridian Times running their hiding game that was not a hiding game. He had been turning it over for 2 years. "Because every war taught them something," he said, and they wrote it down. The archive had a section on something called military psychology. Orethvel read it in pieces, over 2 days, because reading it in full felt like staring into something that had no bottom. Humans had spent an enormous amount of time studying what war did to the people who fought it. Not just the external effects, casualties, territory, economics, but the internal ones. What happened inside a person's mind when they were exposed to sustained violence and fear and loss. How it changed them. How it damaged them. How some people recovered and some did not. They had names for the damage. Specific names, with specific symptoms, studied across generations of soldiers from hundreds of different wars. They had developed treatments. Imperfect treatments. The record made clear the damage was never easy to undo, but treatments, built from careful observation and documented outcomes and constant revision, they had built an entire field of medicine around the specific ways that war broke the people who fought it. He sat with this for a long time. The Veth had nothing like it. It was not that they had tried and failed. The category simply didn't exist. In 5 wars across thousands of years, the question of what sustained combat did to a soldier's inner world had never accumulated enough data to become a field of study. The humans had so much data on this that it had become its own science. He thought about what that meant, not the science itself, the existence of it, the volume of experience that had made it necessary. How many soldiers, across how many centuries, had come home changed in ways that required a whole field of medicine to address, and they had kept going. Every generation, they had kept going. He assembled the full briefing on the 7th day. He had worked without sleeping more than a few hours at a stretch. He had read everything the archive contained that was relevant: the military history, the strategic theory, the psychology, the weapons development records, the logistics manuals, the tactical doctrine going back 3,000 years. He had read personal accounts from soldiers in wars that had ended before the Veth reached space. He had read the letters that soldiers sent home, which the archive had preserved, and this had been the hardest part, because the letters were small and specific and human in a way that the tactical documents were not, and they made the 416 wars real in a way that the numbers alone did not. He put the full briefing together. He organized it clearly. He chose specific documents to present: the Sun Tzu text, the Clausewitz, the Boyd framework, the casualty tables, 3 selected letters from the personal accounts section. He brought it to the conclave, not just the intelligence directorate, the full conclave, all 7 divisions. He had requested the meeting through official channels and listed the subject as Fundamental Strategic Reassessment Human Conflict. He had not elaborated, because he knew that if he summarized the content in the meeting request, the meeting would be denied. It was not denied. He stood in the conclave chamber on a morning that was bright and ordinary, and he set the Sun Tzu translation on the table, in front of 7 senior officials, who were looking at him with the polite attention of people who expected to be slightly bored. He said, "This document was written 2,500 years ago. It describes, with near perfect accuracy, the primary tactics used against our fleet in the past 18 months. Silence. The humans did not develop these tactics for this war. These are their standard approaches, the ones they teach, the ones they have been teaching for centuries." He put the casualty table on the table. This is what human warfare has cost them, against each other, in a single century. 1 century. The 20th. He let them look at it. We have lost fewer soldiers in all 5 of our wars across our entire history. The silence in the room changed. It became a different kind of silence. "We did not pick a fight with a primitive species," he said. His voice was steady. He had practiced keeping it steady. "We interrupted something that has been going on for 4,000 years. Something that has killed more of them than we can count and that they have survived every single time. Something they have studied and written about and refined for millennia." He looked at the 7 officials. "We woke something up." The meeting lasted 4 hours. The questions were sharp and serious in a way that previous meetings had not been. Nobody dismissed the casualty table. Nobody called the Sun Tzu text irrelevant. The conclave chamber was full of a quality of attention that Orathvel recognized as the attention of people recalibrating the particular mental effort of updating a picture of the world that turns out to have been wrong. The reclassification request was approved that afternoon. Not to Class Quattro. The conclave created a new category. It had no precedent in their system. It took 3 hours of terminology discussion to name it. The final name, in the Veth diplomatic language, translated to something close to entity of sustained conflict capacity, indefinite ceiling. Orathvel thought the name was too long and too cautious. He knew it would not stay theoretical for long. That evening, the human counteroffensive that had been building for 2 months hit the Veth's forward lines in the inner arm. 4-star systems, 14 days. He stayed at his desk and watched the reports come in and thought about a book written 25 centuries ago by a man who had been dead long before humanity left its home planet. He thought about the fact that they had kept it, that it had worked, that it was still working. He picked up his private file and looked at the front page. 112 pages. He had stopped adding to it weeks ago, when he thought he had understood enough. He opened it to a blank page. He picked up his pen. He started writing again. The ceasefire offer arrived on a Tuesday. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A formal, structured, precisely worded offer from Earth's Unified Defense Command, transmitted through the standard diplomatic channel at 0900 hours, with a response window of 72 hours and a full framework of proposed terms already attached. The terms were reasonable. This was, in many ways, the most disturbing thing about them. The Veth conclave spent 48 of the 72 hours doing nothing, except trying to find what was wrong with the terms. They hired translators, legal experts, and diplomatic historians to go through the document line by line. They ran scenario models. They wargamed every possible interpretation of every clause. The terms were reasonable, genuinely, measurably, without obvious trap or trick, reasonable. The humans were asking for the return of captured personnel and vessels, a defined buffer zone around their settled space, recognition of their territorial boundaries, and reparations for the Times Meridian Times colony mission. The reparations number was specific and documented the actual assessed economic loss from the detained mission, calculated at fair market rates. They were not asking for blood. They were not demanding the kind of peace that looked like the other side's surrender. They were offering terms that left the Veth with dignity. One of the senior conclave members said, in a closed session, that this concerned him more than an aggressive demand would have. An aggressive demand was something you understood. It fit the shape of what happened when one side was winning. Reasonable terms from a winning side had a different shape, and he had been sitting with it for 2 days and could not quite name what the shape was. Orathvel, who had been in the closed session as a technical advisor, thought he could name it, but he waited to say so. The prisoner exchange took place at a neutral point between human and Veth space, on a station that had been designated as a contact site before the war started and had seen no fighting. Oreth Vel was there as part of the official Veth documentation team. He had asked to be there. He had asked specifically and with written justification, which he submitted twice, because the first request was ignored. The justification was that as the primary behavioral analyst on the human file, his presence at first formal contact would produce useful data. The real reason was that he needed to see. The human ship that docked was a military vessel, clean lines, functional design, none of the apologetic smallness of the Times Meridian. It was not large by Veth standards, but it moved with the precise, unhurried confidence of something that had been built to do exactly what it was doing, and knew it. The Veth detainees came across the docking bridge, first 47 military personnel, captured in various engagements, looking tired and restrained, but unharmed. They had been held in conditions the human report described as within accepted standards, and the Veth medical team's assessment afterward confirmed this. Then the human detainees came across. There were 22 of them, various capture points over the past 2 years. They walked off the bridge in a loose group, and they looked. He searched for the word. Assessed. That was the word. Not relieved, not depleted. Not the way prisoners looked when they had been held somewhere difficult for a long time. They looked like people who had been somewhere and paid very close attention the whole time, and were now carrying the results of that attention with them. He recognized the quality of it. It was the same thing he had seen through observation glass on the Times Meridian 2 years ago. The girl who had fixed on the exact spot where his face was. The children running their game. The old man picking up a piece of cloth. These were those people, grown 2 years older, doing what those people did. Counting. Still, the human exchange officer was a compact, calm woman, whose rank insignia translated to something between colonel and general. Her name, from the documentation, was Lynn Vasquez. She conducted the exchange with professional efficiency, counted, confirmed, signed the verification forms, and then stood on the Veth side of the docking bay for a moment, as if she was deciding whether to say something. She said something. She looked at the Veth documentation team, which meant, because he was standing closest, she looked at Oreth Vel and she said, "Is there a xenobiologist on your team?" He said yes. He was. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you a question?" He said yes. She said, "What did you think we were?" He had been asked versions of this question in his own head for 2 years. He had answered it in his private file, across many pages, in ways that kept needing revision. He had a long, careful, accurate answer available. He said, "We thought you were just beginning." She nodded slowly. She looked at nothing specific for a moment. "We are," she said. "We absolutely are." She didn't say it with any particular weight. She said it the way you acknowledge a thing that is simply true and requires no decoration. Then she went back across the bridge. He stood in the docking bay and thought about that for a very long time. The holding facility where Oreth Vel spent the next 6 weeks was not a place he had expected to see from the inside. When the Conclave's Internal Review Board completed its examination of the intelligence failures leading up to the war, a review that was politely but unmistakably triggered by his reclassification requests, and the documented record of their denial, he had been asked, very formally and without particular warmth, to make himself available for interview at a human-administered holding site while the review completed its work. This was not, technically, imprisonment. It felt, technically, like imprisonment. The human facility was aggressively comfortable in a way that he suspected was deliberate. Good food, adequate space, natural light, quiet. His possessions had been transferred from his quarters on Veth Prime, including his physical files, which arrived in a sealed box that had not been opened. He spent the first week sleeping more than he had in 2 years. On the 8th day, the human commander of the facility came to speak with him. Not for official purposes, the official interviews were conducted by a different team, by the book, recorded and formal. This was different. She came alone, without a recorder, and sat across from him in the small common room and asked if he minded talking. He said he didn't mind. Her name was Commander Ella Ose. He noticed the surname before she had finished introducing herself. She noticed him noticing. "Delara's older sister," she said. "She mentioned you in her debrief." He waited. She said you looked away first. He said, yes. Ella Osei sat back in her chair and looked at him with something that was not hostility, and was not warmth, and was not quite either. He said, can I ask you something? She said, you can ask. What are you? She considered it. Not like a question she hadn't heard before. More like a question she had heard from different angles, and was deciding which angle to use with him specifically. Survivors, she said. From a planet that was trying to kill us every day for 4 million years before we were recognizably what we are now. So we got very good at not dying. Then we ran out of predators, and we turned on each other. And we spent 10,000 years getting good at that too. She paused. You're the first war we've had where the other side could talk back. We almost didn't notice the difference. She said it without any particular cruelty. Just the flat, even quality of something stated accurately. I think that's the most frightening sentence I've ever heard, he said. She thought about it. I think you're probably right, she said. And she seemed to mean it, seemed genuinely, calmly aware that the thing she had just said was frightening, and to have no particular distress about its being so. She stood up. She looked at the box with his files in it. The review board will finish in 2 weeks, she said. They'll clear you. Your file record will help. She paused at the door. You kept good records. He looked at the box. For a long time, he said. I wasn't sure anyone would read them. How? She said. Someone will. Then she left, and he sat in the comfortable room in the quiet facility, with the natural light coming through the window, and he thought about a woman named Delara Osei, sitting against a wall on the Times, Meridian Times, doing arithmetic in her head, and her sister sitting across from him 2 years later doing something that was probably arithmetic too, and the whole dense, unbroken line between those two moments. The ceasefire held. The terms were implemented exactly as written. Captured personnel returned. Buffer zones established. Territorial boundaries registered in the Galactic Registry. Reparations paid. On schedule. At the agreed amount. The war was over. On paper. What had happened to the Veth Conclave in the 2 years of that war was harder to put on paper, and harder still to explain to the other spacefaring species who began, quietly, sending diplomatic requests for information in the months that followed. The requests were polite and careful, and framed as academic interest in the conflict's resolution. They were not academic. Everyone in the diplomatic community understood what they actually were. 14 different species, looking at what had happened and trying to understand how much danger they were in and from what direction. Orith Vel was given the task of writing the formal Galactic Registry report on humanity. Not the internal report. Not the classified assessment. The public one, the document that would go into the registry and be accessible to every spacefaring species with diplomatic standing. The document that would replace humanity's existing classification entry, which currently read, Class 2 Emerging Civilization, and had been last updated 2 years and a catastrophically expensive war ago. He sat with this task for 3 days before he began writing. He wrote the first 10 pages quickly. They were data, fleet losses on both sides, systems changed hands, economic impact, casualty figures, the basic architecture of what had happened. In numbers, he was good at this. He had been building toward these numbers for 2 years. The 11th page stopped him. The 11th page was the classification, the category, the 2 or 3 words that would sit in the registry next to humanity's name and tell every other species in the known galaxy what they were looking at when they looked at Earth. He sat with the blank page for a long time. He thought about the children's game that was not a game. He thought about the map drawn in blood by an old man's broken hands. He thought about a woman who had been asking questions about Veth patrol rotation schedules, while pretending to be curious about Veth biology, and her sister who sat across from him 2 years later and said, Times. We almost didn't notice the difference. Times without blinking. He thought about Sun Tzu, 2,500 years old, describing last year's war. He thought about Boyd, describing the speed at which the human tactical doctrine had moved through the Veth command structure's ability to track it. He thought about 416 wars, recorded and archived and studied and built upon, a mountain of conflict that would have ended any other species, and had instead made this one into what it was. He thought about the ceasefire terms, the reasonable, measured, dignified ceasefire terms, offered by a side that had been winning, and could have asked for more and had not. He thought about what that restraint was, where it came from, What it meant that a species capable of all of this, capable of the archive and the tactics, and the psychological operations department, and the blood-drawn maps, was also capable of pulling back, of choosing, deliberately and consciously, to stop. He wrote the 11th page. He wrote a single paragraph. He wrote it 3 times before the translation felt right. There was a concept in the old Veth language pre-spaceflight, from the era when his own world had things in it that could kill you, that described an apex predator in a specific state. Not hunting, not sleeping. The state between those two things, when the predator was aware of you and had decided, for its own reasons, not to act. The state was not peace. It was choice. The predator could end you. It had decided not to. It was watching to see whether it would need to change its mind. He used that word. He placed it in the universal diplomatic language, choosing cognates that would translate cleanly into all 14 major species' tongues, so that the meaning would carry without losing its weight. He submitted the report. The response came from 14 star systems in the space of 3 weeks. Not formally, not through official channels, through the quiet, sideways movements of bureaucracies, doing things they were not prepared to announce, updating internal documents, revising contact protocols, restructuring border policies in the outer territories adjacent to human space. A species in the Orith Arm quietly redirected 3 warships from a patrol route that had previously passed close to a human colony site. A species on the far side of the inner systems updated their intelligence assessment of humanity from non-contact peripheral to priority monitoring. A species that had, as recently as 6 months ago, been in early-stage contact talks with Earth's diplomatic division, suddenly developed a preference for taking those talks slowly, very slowly. A junior diplomat from one of the 14 systems sent Orithvel a private message, not through official channels, that read, "We read the report. We read the archive summary. We wanted to ask whether the classification entry is intended as a warning or as a description." Orithvel thought about this for a while. He wrote back, "Both. They are the same thing." He did not hear back. He had not expected to. He was cleared by the review board on a Thursday. He went back to his office on Veth Prime, which had been kept as he left it. His desk was clean. The official data feeds were running. There was a stack of new analytical requests waiting in his queue: routine assessments, threat evaluations, the normal work of his normal job. He sat down. He looked at the stack. He looked at the box of physical files that had come back from the human facility with him. 112 pages, plus the additions he had made after the counteroffensive, plus the pages from the holding facility. He opened his private file. He turned to the last page. He read what he had written on the night the war effectively ended the night. The human counteroffensive took 4 systems in 11 days, and the math on the Conclave's briefings stopped working. What we are calling adaptation is not adaptation. He remembered writing that in month 2, before he had the vocabulary for what he was actually seeing. He had been right about the conclusion and wrong about the scale of it. He had understood the thing as a tactical property, a characteristic of how they fought. He had not yet understood it as a characteristic of what they were. That the fighting was a symptom, not the root. The root was older, 4 million years of a killing planet, 10,000 years of killing each other. And then the notebooks, the records, the careful, patient, continuous act of writing it down and reading it back and doing it better next time. The humans had not become dangerous because of war. War had revealed what they already were. He closed the file. He looked at the ordinary work on his desk, the routine assessments, the standard queue. He looked at it for a while. Then he opened a new document, not private, this time, an official document, formatted correctly, assigned to the proper case file, a proposal for a new field of study within the Conclave Science Division. It did not yet have a name. He spent 20 minutes on the name before settling on something plain: contact studies, species of sustained conflict capacity. The proposal was for a permanent, funded research program dedicated to understanding how a species became what humanity was. Not to replicate it, that was not possible, he did not think, from outside the conditions that had produced it, but to understand it, to know what it was that they were living next to. The Galactic Registry entry would be updated soon. All 14 species had received it. Most of them had, by now, made the quiet adjustments to their border policies and patrol routes and diplomatic approaches. They were treating humanity the way his pre-spaceflight ancestors had treated the predators of their old world, with deep, careful, watchful respect. He thought this was correct. He thought it was, given what the archive contained and what the past 2 years had demonstrated, the only accurate response. He thought about a small ship, embarrassing in its smallness, hanging in Veth Docking Bay 7. He thought about an old man with one lung and arthritic hands, in a room he had never seen before, picking up a piece of torn cloth on day 3. Because starting early was simply what they did. He thought about reasonable ceasefire terms from a side that could have asked for more. The restraint, the leash, the choice, the predator, aware of you, watching to see whether it would need to change its mind. The classification entry sat in the Galactic Registry, under humanity's name, where Class 2, Emerging Civilization, used to be. 2 words, in 14 star systems, in languages that had no common roots and no shared history, in the minds of species that looked nothing like each other and had built their civilizations on entirely different foundations. Those 2 words translated cleanly. They always did. Some meanings carry. Do not wake.